You see, this was originally going to be a video about me simply restoring a B2 roller I had received as a gift from a racer in Alabama. However, after going to a little car show in Woodstock, I saw this. A fully resto-modded Dodge Challenger. 8 liters and a full suite of modern brakes, suspension, and propulsion. Now to be honest, I don't really have the money to do that, but thanks to the help of an extremely generous patron I will refer to as GigaChad, I can apply that same idea to something much smaller. What you're looking at now is an RC Team Associated RC10 B2. It probably saw a lot of use back in its glory days, but now let's see if we can breathe some new life into it. Before we begin, I'd like to take this opportunity to remind you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and comment what you think of the video. Alrighty then, let's begin. The first thing I wanted to do was disassemble the car, partially to clean it, but also to see how it worked. Taking this thing apart, I realized two things. One, the car is quite simple, and two, I faced my first obstacle, imperial screw sizes. Most of the car could be taken apart with a 1.5mm driver, but a few screws were different. What you're seeing now is me going through and seeing the condition of everything on the inside, bearings mostly. We'll get back to that in a bit. The next thing I wanted to do was get the majority of this battery foam on the battery holding area so I could 3D print a new battery holder for modern size shorty packs. It was really stuck there though. At first I kind of tried to mechanically remove it with a sort of dull knife, but that wasn't really working the way I wanted it to. So I ended up switching to a wire brush, and that seemed to work well enough. After some scrubbing, I managed to get it done. I also got most of that weird white dust in the cracks and crevices of the car that I assume isn't going to slowly kill me with an old toothbrush, and some simple green mixed with hot water. Seemed to work pretty well. Another thing to note is the fact that the internals of the actual buggy were, to put it lightly, in a state I have never seen before. The metal diff guide balls had actually fused to the plastic inside the differential, so it was safe to say the diff could not be saved. Another thing, neither could the bearings of the diff housing in the transmission. We would need a spare. Now it's at this point that I want to go a little bit into this history of the B2 while I look for a replacement. You see, the B2 wasn't around for very long compared to the RC10 before it and the B3 after that. However, for the time it was around, it made some headway at the 1995 IFMAR Worlds at the Itabe Arena, Yokomo's home track to this day. The car was fast, and by fast, I mean it was the fastest in both the qualifier and the mains, placing both first and second on the podium. As for its features, it was the first buggy from Associated to have a composite or plastic chassis. It had more suspension travel, a redesigned 2.4 to 1 transmission that carried over to the later B3, lengthened shocks, and a few other things. Even to this day, the B2 is a very solid buggy on looser tracks, even if it is a bit fragile. The B2 won many regionals and nationals for its time, and would go on to basically be the base for a much longer-lived B3. If anything, the B3 can be considered an evolved B2. Even certain parts carry over. And that brings me back to the project at hand. Thanks to a good friend of mine who I refer to as Acton Jackson, I was able to find a spare transmission I was able to pick apart to rebuild at least one good one that can go in the car. I was also realizing that I was barely able to take apart the car as a whole. Not because it was rusted or anything like that, but because all of the screws and screw heads were either Phillips heads, which made me itch looking at them, or imperial size instead of metric. And of course, being someone who got into the hobby much later on, I don't have any standard size tools, so that gave me another idea. You see, like I originally said towards the beginning of the video, this was originally just going to be a restoration with a few liberties taken to make the car drivable, but still more or less a shelf queen. Once I realized that a lot of the parts would be either really expensive or on eBay, or non-existent, for example, a screw kit, and the fact that my local track will be running a vintage class very soon, I knew my plans had to change. And that's when I ordered a bunch of things off A-Main Hobbies and jconcepts.net. Not sponsored, but if you're from either of those places and you're watching, my DMs are always open. Anyway, I ended up buying a full metric screw kit and replacing pretty much any screw I could access on the car as the build went on. One thing I wanted to fix was this play in the front shock tower that could be attributed to a backed out screw, so let's go ahead and replace and tighten those down. There we are. And just like that, no play. Another thing I had planned to do before I actually got the buggy was to replace all the turnbuckles with one for the modern buggy, but it looks like the previous owner already did that, so I guess less work for me. Right, now that we got that out of the way, how about we deal with this body? Now, I'm not going to toss these old bodies as they have history to them, and I can probably run them on really sticky get-everywhere clay at the track I usually run at 10th scale. However, because I really like the color pink, and the fact that I got myself a bunch of stickers, check out my Patreon in the description below for those, I wanted to paint myself a new body for the old car. Luckily, J Concept still makes retro bodies and wheels, so I ordered some from them, and here they are. Let's open up the body and cut it to fit the buggy. Alright, now that we got it cut up, let's see what it looks like on the car. Huh. Now it's starting to look almost like an unfinished kit from the 90s. Anyway, I did film myself actually painting the actual body, but the footage got corrupted for some reason, so here's the final result with the sticker. Next up we have the shocks. Now I was going to grab some new shocks from a B6 donor car, but that deal ended up falling through. At the time I thought I'd have to put the project on hold until I could procure some new ones. But that's when I was looking through some of my old RC stuff when I found these. These are retro RC10 B2 springs, and they actually work with these shocks. So off I went to refresh the shock oil that had been sitting for God knows how long, with AE30 weight in the front and no C30 weight in the rear, as it's sort of the base setup, and it's sort of what I had on the hand. It does feel quite stiff even with the softer springs, so I'll probably end up running less weight in the future. And before you comment, yes, I know I put the front shocks in the wrong place. I'll fix that as soon as possible. I decided to run something as mild as I possibly could as to not shatter the internals. After all, these things weren't meant to run on brushless systems. So I grabbed the second least powerful motor I could find. A Hobbywing 17.5 turn just stock FTM motor, and a Reedy Black Box 60 amp ESC for variety's sake, and because the Hobbywing 60 amp just stock ESC was out of stock at the time of this recording. I also grabbed a Savox 1258 TG servo, because that's pretty much what I run in all my 10th scale rigs, and a Sandwall receiver that was way too expensive. Well, let's get them put in. Before we get this thing to the track and actually run it, I'm going to take it out to the parking lot to test it to see if everything's actually working. And it does. You know, this is a weird feeling driving a car that's almost a decade older than you. And also considering this is probably the first time this thing is run in more than 2 decades. Alright. As of the writing of this video, I actually haven't been able to run this at the track, as the closest one to me is a solid hour away and they're closed, so we're going to have to end it here. Don't worry though. This project is far from finished, as I'll be running this thing at a track or two in the near future. And I do mean the very near future. If you did make it this far in the video, I really appreciate you. Speaking of appreciation, I'd like to thank one of my patrons. Without him, this entire video and project would not have been possible. Speaking of which, I'd like to thank my patrons Michael Williams, Lucas Tarka, RC World Discord server, Casey Nix, Ben Reeve, Dave Armstrong, Ryan Lamb, Joe Jenkins, The Mailman 110, Juliet Lovelace, Brian Laughlin, and especially Morrison Wadd. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.